The Honourable Colin Holt, and I did neglect to do this with the previous member, but this is the member's inaugural address and I would ask members to observe the usual courtesies. The Honourable Colin Holt.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I start, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet. And let me say that this is a great honour for me to stand in this House and to give my inaugural speech. Some very good colleagues of mine have always said that all the things we have done in our past is in preparation for what we are about to take on, or our next challenge. And in this in mind, I'd like to relay to the House and those guests in the gallery a little about myself to paint a picture about what I've been through in preparation for my time in this House. One of my distant cousins Janice Young, has written a book about the origins of our family, and it traces back our history to arrival back in Australia in 1842. The book is entitled In Search of Elizabeth, and I've just bought it for a bit of show and tell. They were, let me say, very prolific in the issue, and I wouldn't be surprised if other members or people in the gallery weren't related to us somehow in the past. But I bring this tonight to talk about Janice Young. When she released the book, was asked by a journalist, so who are you descended from? Of which she replied, an English farm labourer, a Welsh convict and the Romani. And he replied, but haven't you found someone important in your family? She said, yes, an English farm labourer, a Welsh convict and the Romani. Mr. President, I feel a little the same way. I feel I come from humble beginnings, but which I'm truly proud of. My father was a telecom linesman for 35 years, and my mother was a dedicated mother of 6, of which I am the youngest. We lived in a little fibro house in Gamelling, and while it does not seem too exciting, I was part of a loving and very caring family. And I think it's a credit to our parliamentary system where someone who feels they come from humble beginnings can participate in our parliament. Mum and Dad were committed totally to their family values, and they worked hard to ensure the family had a roof over their heads and food on the table. And they often went without so that we, their children, had their needs met. I'd like to acknowledge my mum, who is in the gallery tonight. She is an incredible woman with amazing strength and fortitude, who would crawl over burning coals for her family. I'd also like to acknowledge my dad, who passed away 2 years ago, and so has missed this chapter in my life. However, I can imagine what he would say of this latest adventure. It'd be along the lines of what he said when I left my very secure job after 14 years, when at that time I had 4 young dependent children, a mortgage, all the normal expenses of family life, and absolutely no client base and no job. I went to the first job I left when I left my secure government job. I set out to be a community development consultant, and my first job was drenching sheep on a mate's farm. That's what you expect, really. My dad grew up in the Depression years, and so his conservative outlook had a very conservative outlook on life and was very risk adverse. He said on to me about leaving my job, and I begged forgiveness of the House, what the bloody hell do you want to do that for? I think he'd probably say the same thing now. However, I'm sure he would be proud of his youngest son. I'd also like to acknowledge my 3 brothers, Lester, Frank and Jeff, and my 2 sisters, Anne and Jen, who are always there to help when you need them most. And I must add, they keep me totally grounded in what I do. They keep me totally aware of all the issues that the most West Australians face, and there is no way that I'll be able to get away with anything with them. I'm sure you they will keep me on the track. I'd also like to recognise my beautiful, enigmatic wife, Floss. She made me put those words in here. She is the perfect foil for me. She's very gregarious in nature, and she has a fantastic ability to gather friends around her. I'd also like to acknowledge my children, Ebony, Zeke, Denzel and Fraser, who undoubtedly have helped make me the person I am today. I thank them publicly here now for their love and support and their blind faith in me. It's interesting, on induction to the House I received some forms from the Legislative Council office, and one of the forms asked me, do I have any significant relatives? Of course I wrote down, yes, all of them. For me, they are all significant, especially my wife and children. So back to a bit of story about me and where I come from. In Gamelling School, I was part of a classroom that had 14 students, and I was faced with the prospect of going away to school to further my education. My folks asked me when I was 14, what would I like to do? Travel by bus to Northam every day so I could be home at night? Or would I like to board in Perth, away from home? For some reason, I jumped at the opportunity to test myself in a new school and a living away from home environment. I guess I wanted to test the opportunity to test my social and leadership skills. I think it was an indicator of my developing attitude to life. Let's give it a go and we'll work out the details a little later on. That kind of attitude has followed me through life. That decision at that time was a good one. I formed many great friendships that are still relevant today. Those friendships are nearly 30 years old, and I thank all those for their support and belief in me. I would like to name them all, but in fear of missing someone, I won't do it, and it would also sound like a metrosexual zoo. However, there is one group of people I would like to mention, and that is the Spinifex, who are lifelong friends and will continue to be to the day I leave this earth. After school, I stayed in Perth and completed a Bachelor of Science degree at the UWA, orienting myself around the footy team, which is full of country boys just like myself. I then joined the Department of Agriculture and worked there for 14 years. I was a little young and naive when I first joined the department, and one of the first things I said to one of the executives was, he asked me what I'd like to do, and I said, I hope I go a long way. They immediately sent me to Derby and the Kimberley. However, I saw this as another opportunity to expand my horizons and my experience, and another chance to go, I'll put up my hand and we'll see what happens. Fortunate for me, that is where I met my wife, and again, I thank her for being here and sticking by me. While working in the Department of Agriculture, I lived and worked in almost every region of WA, including Bruce Rock, Halls Creek, Carnarvon, Narrogin for almost 7 years, and Australind. It seemed that we had a new child in almost every town we lived in, keeping the maternity ward busy in those country hospitals. I had many roles, including border quarantine. I was involved in donkey control. I was the coordinator for the feral goat eradication campaign. I was a land care officer, and eventually I moved into a training role which sparked my deep interest in helping others to gain skills and knowledge and to help them reach their potential. I've lived in many places and participated in many different types of communities and met a lot of regional West Australians. And I've learnt that although WA is geographically large, the WA regional community is quite small, and you just never know where you'll run into people. Almost every day I run into someone who I knew from school, knew from sport, who I worked with or socialised with, almost every day, and you never know where they might turn up. And from all those years in regional WA, I've gained a wealth of experience that I believe will help me greatly to work as an elected member. I'd also like to tell a little experience that I had when we were camping in the heart of the Murchison one day. There was a group of us there for talking about feral goat eradication. And we're standing around a campfire, and there was a Vietnam veteran there who was obviously a very, very proud Australian. The president of the RSL in Carnarvon at the time truly lived for Anzac Day and ensured that he marched every year. There's also a Canadian-born Australian who emigrated to Australia when he was about 20 years old. Anyway, the discussion turned to who is truly Australian. The Vietnam vet, of course, stood up and said, "I'm truly Australian because I fought for this country under that flag." And the Canadian stood up and said, "Well, you're just lucky you're born here, mate. I chose to be Australian, so I'm Australian." And as they shaped up to each other around the fire to settle the argument with fisticuffs, I was struck by the passion they both showed. And of course they were both right. They both had a claim to be truly Australian. And just as importantly, they had the right and permission to express their views. I think I learned a valuable lesson from that observation. And just because I was fortunate enough to be born in the greatest state in the greatest country does not make me a greater Australian than anyone who chose to make Australia their home. I welcome any new Australian to add culture to our country, and we've already heard in a number of maiden speeches here of the origins of some of the members. And I would like to acknowledge them and any other member who chose Australia as their home and have chosen to contribute to our state through parliamentary service. I also note here that it is National Refugee Week, and I urge our immigration authorities to act with compassion and empathy for all those looking at making Australia their home. As I've said, I left the Department of Ag 7 years ago and began a consultancy in community development and sheep handling. At the time, I didn't know I was doing community development work. In fact, often you don't. I had just had a desire to work with and learn with communities in a new way. I wanted to make a difference to people's lives. Early on, one of the early projects I was involved with was the WA Community Leadership Program. Myself and my colleagues, some of them who are here in the gallery tonight, visited 27 communities from Wyndham to Esperance, asking those communities to identify 2 Indigenous and 2 non-Indigenous leaders from their communities to participate in the program on their behalf. We worked with those existing and emerging leaders from all over WA. Regional people who are looking at developing their leadership skills to be an asset to their families, communities, region and state. This was real work that engaged at a very personal and community interface and gave me a much greater understanding of all people and Indigenous communities. Everyone who came into contact with that program was in awe of the calibre of people that we have in regional WA. And I see there is a graduate of this program here who joined the program as a young radio announcer, an Indigenous woman from Kununurra as a young radio announcer, and after the program put up a hand and said, "I want to be involved with the Chamber of Commerce in Kununurra," and now works for Argyle as one of their training officers. These are the sort of people we worked with and who gained the knowledge and the confidence to go where they wanted to go. I'm in awe of all these people and eternally grateful to them for sharing their generosity of their experience. Unfortunately, the government of the day ceased that program, and all the momentum and experience that the WA Community Leadership Program had provided was in danger of being lost. But the coordinators of that program decided to form a new community development company. I joined 6 like-minded colleagues to continue to work with communities the length and breadth of WA, and this work has continued now for the last 6 years. I am passionate about this type of work, and I am passionate about the people of this state who want to make a difference, be it at whatever level they choose. That can be a family level, they could be involved with their community as a volunteer, take on leadership roles within the community or within the region, stand up for state politics or state industries, and if they want to, go to the national level. The company that we helped form had a belief that everyone can be like a pebble in a pond. Everyone can make an impact beyond their own presence. And in communities, small things do matter and can make a huge difference. You just have to be willing to make a wave. I believe everyone deserves to have the opportunity to learn and develop those skills that make a difference in their community. Before I move on, I would also like to quickly touch on social isolation that faces many people in regional WA. I'm especially concerned for social isolation for the young people in the regions. I remember being told a story from a person in Hyden who had organised 2 busloads of young ladies to go from Perth out to Hyden for a get-together and a cabaret at the Hyden Town Hall. I remember she telling me about how the young men of that community actually didn't have too many social skills. They kind of spend their lives on the farm, maybe seeing their mum, their sister, working with their dad all day long, going into the footy club, footy training, playing in a footy team. Not too much social interaction with girls in the community. And I was thinking, and it struck to me then that there's a real issue here if we don't do something about it. Social isolation is an issue, and there's many times that, well, if you look at the suicide statistics for young people, especially young men in regional WA, I think you'd be appalled. One special mention I'd like to make is to a very dear mentor of mine, Lee Hardingham, who really started me on this journey to this house. I remember sitting with her one day at the back of Jumar House when we were involved with the WA Community Leadership Program, and she said to me, "What do you aspire to do with your leadership?" And I said, "Oh, I'm thinking about joining the local shire." And she looked over at the Parliament House here and said, "Have you thought about that house over there?" Of which, of course, I hadn't, but immediately did. And as goes with my attitude to life, I thought, I'll put up my hand and give it a go. So I ran in the southwest as a second on the ticket in 2005, which was unsuccessful. I ran not really knowing what I was getting into, but having the faith that and the confidence that I'll work it out when I get there. Thank you, Lee, for those many, many, many hours of mentoring conversation. You truly have given me some confidence that I can stand up here tonight, even though a little nervous, and address my peers and the people in the gallery. At this point, I'd like to acknowledge my parliamentary colleagues from the National Party who have helped me start this latest chapter in my life. I'd especially like to acknowledge those who masterminded the Royalties for Regions policy and the brilliant campaign at the last election. It goes without saying that policy and all the hard work from those members, hard work from a dedicated party, an army of rank and file members and a range of volunteers who helped me, and the faith shown in the policy by the people in regional WA, and in particular South West, is why I am here in this house now. Thank you guys, one and all. The Royalties for Regions campaign was built on a simple but effective message that captured the imagination of the people the Nationals represent. They dared to imagine their region, which had services and infrastructure that met their needs. They dared to imagine effective health services, more educational resources, including vocational education. They dared to imagine about adequate policing. They dared to imagine about funds to invest in their community assets that the community themselves felt was important. They dared to imagine improved housing for essential workers, police, nurses and teachers. And they dared to imagine the increased assistance through PATS and aged pensioners' fuel card and the difference that those things could make in their lives. They dared to imagine RFDS with 5 new planes and new funds to local governments to spend on community projects that made real differences in their lives. This policy wasn't, though, just about increased services and infrastructure. It sent a clear message to those living in the regions who had felt ignored for far too long that they actually did matter, that they were an integral part of this state, and the belief that they, their families and their communities were worth investing in. If any of you guys travelled around the regions after the election, I don't think you could not have gone without noticing the difference in the people's attitude from Royalties for Regions. I share the belief that Royalties for Regions made that great contribution to them. I intend to spend the time in my house representing the people of the South West, building on and delivering the Royalties for Regions policy. And to complement the delivery of services infrastructure in the regions, I intend to spend my time investing in the social and human capacity of the people in the South West and throughout the regions. I want to spend my time helping the people of the regions to help themselves, to give them the skills and experience that allows them to be leaders and advocates for their communities and their regions. I am passionate about the regions of WA and the people who choose to work, live and raise their families there. I'm going to work towards the development of regional programs and services that give them the educational and experiential mechanisms to build their skills, self-confidence and abilities to make sure they make the most of the opportunities that Royalties for Regions presents for them. I am passionate about helping those who are willing to put up their hand and take on a role. If someone is willing to have a go, I want to be able to help them to have that go. Cannot finish without a quick mention of the balance of power. The Nationals hold the balance of power in both these places, a position that holds a great deal of responsibility. Responsibility to provide good government to the whole of WA, and a responsibility to the people who the Nationals represent, people from regional WA, to ensure that we deliver for them. In closing, I would like to thank the House and the guests for their indulgence, and I would once again like to thank my wife and family and friends. When I embarked on this to talk about in the maiden speech, I had about 100 different pieces of advice. One of them was, don't be too idealistic. That was from Dan Hatch, inside cover. And I also got one about, don't bring out too many quotes, because everyone does that. However, I'm going to do one. Quote from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who once said, "We judge ourselves by what we feel capable of doing, while others judge us by what we have already done," which says to me that we should not be fainéant or idle while in this house, but to grab the opportunity that has been afforded each and every one of us to not only represent the people of WA, but to make the most of every opportunity to make a positive difference in the lives of the people of WA. Because in the end, each of us here will judge our own performance by ourselves. We must, in other words, go large. Thank you, Mr. President.